Let's roll. Okay. Thank you for that great music, Ben. So, thank you all for joining us. And sorry to keep you waiting, but there's a lot of you coming in, which is great. So, I just want to begin in the spirit of our recent series, which was on the Native American presence here in the Connecticut River Valley, to begin the event by acknowledging the land from which we're all tuning in. Some of you may be coming from various places along the Connecticut River Valley. From my home in what is called Conway, Massachusetts, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Nipmuc land. And I'd also like to acknowledge the neighboring indigenous nations, the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, and the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki and Pennacook to the north. So many thanks again to all of you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Polly Byers, and I'm the executive director of the Karuna Center, which is a peace building organization, NGO in Amherst. And for those of you who may not know, Karuna started over 25 years ago, focused on bridging divides in countries affected by violence, and has worked in over 40 countries using a variety of approaches to support dialogue, foster reconciliation, and build inclusive governance. And as many of you know, it was founded by Paula Green, today's speaker, along with Ben Fink. So I want to welcome you to this first event in a new series we're calling Building Community Across Divides, Lessons from Far and Near. The idea behind the series is to examine what's been learned from peace building work around the world and the use of dialogue, mediation, and other community-based approaches to healing and bridging divides and interrupting cycles of violence. And certainly we know that many people in the US are looking for ways to address the political polarization that's intensified over the last year and to prevent further violence, and also for ways to support positive change and facilitate communication and connection. So our idea was to draw on some of Karuna's work and partnerships in a number of countries, including Bosnia, Rwanda, and Nigeria, as well as to look at and highlight some of the amazing and powerful work that's going on right here in the US now. And we're obviously about to hear one example, to help us all think about ways to address the challenges and the us versus them thinking that is so prevalent now. So the goal of the series is both to inspire more efforts here in the US to address the divides and hopefully offer ideas on how people can become more engaged in actively supporting positive change. And as you may gather, we think that there's a lot we can learn, both from peace building work around the world, as well as a host of different initiatives that are underway here in the US. So with that brief background and introduction to the series, I want to introduce today's talk, The Power of Dialogue, Finding Friendship and Joy in Unpredictable Relationships, with Paula Green and Ben Fink, who together developed Hands Across the Hills with their very different communities in Western Mass and in Eastern Kentucky. Some of you may have heard about it because it's gotten extensive coverage, most recently on CBS Evening News and a lot of other press that I don't have time to mention. So while there's a lot I could say to introduce both Paula and Ben, I'm going to try to keep it short so we can move on to hearing from them. So Paula has 40 years of experience as a psychologist, peace educator, facilitator, and mentor in the field of intergroup relations and the resolution of community conflicts. In 1994, she founded the Karuna Center for Peace Building, focused on international conflict transformation, intercommunal dialogue, and reconciliation. She's a professor emerita at the School for International Training in the US, where she founded and directed Contact, which is the conflict transformation across cultures program with its 2 annual institutes and graduate certificate programs for peacemakers from around the world. And her work has really taken her everywhere: Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe, as well as within the US, where she resides, consults, and teaches. And after the 2016 election, Paula has focused really on restoring US relations, which have been fractured by political and cultural divides. She serves as an active board member for a range of organizations and happily continues to engage with the Karuna Center as a senior peace building advisor and consultant. Ben Fink works with community centers of power and their allies in cultural, religious, service, justice, government, business, and educational organizations to create the conditions for people of all kinds to come together across imposed divides and share stories, build power, and create wealth. He's organized in deindustrialized areas across the country, including the Appalachian coalfields, the Naugatuck Valley of Connecticut, and the urban centers of Baltimore, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis-St. Paul. In addition to co-founding Hands Across the Hills, Ben is a founding organizer of the National Performing Our Future Coalition and the Letcher County Culture Hub in East Kentucky. He's also trained and directed a homeless housed theater project in Minneapolis, and he holds a PhD in cultural studies from the University of Minnesota. His work has been featured in many publications. And in 2020, Ben and Paula both were recognized by Time Magazine as 2 of the 27 people bridging divides across America. So we have some stars here for you. So I am going to, with that, turn it over to Ben and Paula with the last little reminder that please to keep yourselves muted and feel free to put questions in the chat box. And after they're finished talking, they're going to take questions. So just use the chat box whenever you have ideas about questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to them.
Well, that was quite an introduction. And what's happening for me at the moment is a memory trip down so many lanes, because I'm seeing people here I haven't seen in decades. And I don't know how they showed up or how they heard about this, but it's just a joy for me. So from the beginning of Karuna Center, it was clear that our work was going to be about bridging divides. Our first large assignment was post-war Bosnia, and my colleague Anne Hoeing, who was in this audience and I haven't seen in maybe 20 years or who knows how long, was my partner in that work. So that's wonderful to have this reunion as I introduce this evening. And the divides were a consequence of a bitter war for power and territory in Bosnia. We were called early to Rwanda. I was there the year after the 1994 genocide. And we have programs that have gone to the present day. We've continued all those decades, our commitment to the Rwandans. And that's another place where the divides left everybody shattered and 1 million people dead. I worked even before I started Karuna Center in Myanmar, then called Burma, a very divided society, now in big trouble with another military coup. They're rather endless. Israel and Palestine is divided even with the naming and everything about it. Sri Lanka, Nepal, Macedonia, Kosovo, Armenia and Azerbaijan, South Sudan and Sudan, India, Pakistan. The list goes on. And it's all about divides. It's always been about divides. Divides don't cause the war. Divides are a consequence of the war. And they're very hard to repair. After 2016, my community was very interested in bridging those divides. Ben and I are going to go back and forth and talk about that. Just to say that for me, Hands Across the Hills was a natural. It felt time to bring everything I'd learned from 40 years overseas to the chaos and threats to our country. And what I saw was that the kinds of problems that were happening here led in so many places to armed conflict. And that certainly scared me. So I was very willing to focus domestically. I still do some international programs for Karuna Center and others, but I'm very committed now to Hands Across the Hills and bridging divides. So the way we're going to do this is Ben and I are going to ask each other questions. We're each going to take 5 minutes to respond to them. The first one's going to be about our beginnings, and then the methods we used, and then our personal transformation. And then we'll show you a video clip, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So Ben, you're going to start me off on the first question, right?
Yeah, which is, I think, the kind of most sort of basic question is, from your perspective and the community that you're both working with and are a part of in Leverett, why did people do it? What brought people to this work? What were they hungry for? Why did they get involved in the first place?
Great question. So you can time me for 5 minutes.
Got it.
Leverett is a small town just outside of Amherst, which is my residence. And some years ago, my husband and I and a few colleagues had started something called the Leverett Peace Commission. We were opposing one of the endless wars that our country's gotten into. And we decided to call a meeting in the library just after the election. The town is largely progressive. 85% of the people voted for Hillary. And we were wanting to talk to each other. This is before COVID, we could meet in person. And we gathered in the library and we talked about, what do we do? How do we respond? And we decided to form into a number of working groups. One of them we called Bridging, not knowing where that was going or what it even would mean. And because this has been my life work, I wound up chairing it. But the energy to put it together belongs to the entire group. We all worked very, very hard on having this happen. And we wanted to understand what had happened to our country. I think we had fear about the implication of this election. and where it was taking us. We wanted somehow to wrap our minds around who the people were who voted for Trump, why they voted for Trump, what their intentions were for the country, and how we could fathom the vast differences in our perception about who was a better candidate. And so we started out looking for people in our own area. And I went to several clergy people who I knew and social workers. There were many towns around here that were Trump voting communities. And we found no takers. It was so soon after the election. It was even before the inauguration. Emotions were very high. And I think people felt that we were going to scold and yell and blame and not really engage. So we got a lot of turn downs, and it went kind of quiet for a while. And then Jay, one of the colleagues in the group, saw an article online that Ben had written that talked about dialogue and bridging, used language like that. And there was this aha moment, and Jay drafted a letter, which Ben will tell you about. And that was how we found each other. We would have never in our lives found each other. As it turned out, it couldn't have been a more perfect match, because their county, Letcher County, Kentucky, which is in the east, coal mining region, voted 85% for Trump. So we were a pretty perfect match in that way. And we felt extremely grateful to have this. And I think some of the reason for the national publicity part of it is it's a really interesting project and we have a lot of experience. But I think the other part of it is that there's such a contrast between our two communities. And that really matters to all of us. And Kentucky and Massachusetts are about as different as you can get politically, and many other ways as we discovered as this project unfolded. So it's been very meaningful for us that it was Kentucky and that it was Ben. That's all been just miraculous for the project. So that's what we hungered for. That's why we got involved. We started out with about a dozen people, and before we knew it, we had almost 20 people from Massachusetts, and probably could have had 200 if we had expanded further, because people in our greater community in Amherst in the Valley all had the same question of what happened and how do we handle it. So Ben,
Yes,
you were
Paula.
living in Letcher County at the time, although you're not from there, and you got this email.
Yep.
From this total stranger, and
Yep.
take it away.
Yeah, I'm looking at that total stranger down in my window there. Mr. Jay Frost is with us today. I'm very happy to say thank you, Jay. And there's actually a great number of Massachusetts Hands Across the Hills people on, so it's good. They'll keep us honest. Yeah, so I had moved to Letcher County, Kentucky. Letcher County being, if you know about Harlan County from any of the songs or any of the films, it's right over Pine Mountain. So just like Harlan County in the middle of coal country, about an hour and a half from the nearest interstate highway on the border of Virginia. West Virginia is not too far away. And yeah, I had moved down there a year before because of a connection and working with a grassroots theater company called Roadside Theater, which is a division of the Appalachian Media Workshop, or the Apple Shop, APPALSHOP. And it was a project on how can storytelling and building power lead to economic growth and economic development. And what I had been doing in the year before we got that message from Jay is frankly working on healing a lot of divides within Letcher County. You know, I'm a self-described communist Jew from the Northeast. That's what I tell people in East Kentucky who are kind of on the right side of things. People ask me, how does that work out? I tell them it works out real well. Because then I'm curious about what they are interested in too. And, you know, they're going to hear my accent. They're going to see my nose. They're going to know. And so we do this. And so, but I remember my office was in Whitesburg, the county seat, population 1900. So a little bit bigger than Leverett. And I was working out in a community of about 120, a half an hour away in Letcher County. And somebody there called me an outsider, not because I was from the Northeast, but because I was from Whitesburg. So the divides exist on all levels. And the question on all levels is, do we reify them? Do we see them as these natural, insurmountable things? Or do we learn to laugh about it a little bit and then recognize that they've been imposed? So this is, so by the article, and I posted it in the chat, the article that Jay read, it was really about that work. And it was about sort of me recognizing after a year immersing myself in that world that it was a remarkably just a place full of thoughtful people, just like everywhere else, and open-minded people, just like everywhere else. And there were closed-minded and hateful people there, just like there are everywhere else. But the idea that democracy is somehow less possible there because of a vote total was just not my experience at all. And so we had, when that email from Jay came, he read the article, he sent a cold email, I brought it to the people, and specifically to the organization called the Letcher County Culture Hub that I had worked to help start over the previous year. I'll put that in the chat as well. And we had a really tough conversation about it. And because people, and there was a lot of suspicion, there was a lot of concern, a lot of the same stuff that Paula was talking about from when she was talking with people up there in Leverett that were who didn't want to talk about it. So, you know, and even to this day, we don't have the problem, Evan Leverett, of hundreds of people, you know, banging down the door wanting to be part of this. You know, we have got about 5 really solid participants. When we, you know, when we open it up and there's a trip, it can open to about 11 or 12. But there is, you know, there's ongoing suspicion. But the difference is we had already had that work going on, organizing across difference locally and starting to build together and started to make things together. And so that letter came and people were already in the mode of, okay, how do we seize on this as an opportunity? And I asked the 2 most skeptical people in the Culture Hub to write an email back in response, which they did after spending about a month being vetted by the group. Paula keeps writing me, Ben, what's going on? What's going on? Are we going to do this? I said, Paula, wait a second. This is going to take some time, but probably it's going to be worth it. 7 months later, we were driving up in a van of 11 East Kentuckians and 10 East Kentuckians and me up to Leverett in October of 2017. And the work began in earnest.
So there you have our birth stories, the birth of this organization that we never expected to have happen. Ben very wisely thought we shouldn't put the word divides in there. You know, most of these organizations are sort of called bridging divides or hands across the divides. And we got the idea to call it hands across the hills instead.
I said, what do we have in common?
We live in hills and they live in hills, and hills are much nicer than divides. So that's how we got.
And we're both in rural parts of our states that are often forgotten about, that are often, and it's so, you know, we talk about the, you know, Northeasterners' stereotypes of Appalachia. Well, of course, the people in East Kentucky had their own stereotypes. Like the funniest thing was showing up at Leverett Town Hall, which is a little place if you've not been there, and a bunch of people in Kentucky assumed we were going to a city, because obviously everywhere in the blue state north is a city. And so that was that was so cool. Okay, so that actually goes into my next question for you, Paula, which is, so we come up there and we actually, the Kentucky people said, we want to come up first. We don't want, you know, people coming down to just, you know, without a sense of who we are. We want to go up there. And you and all the people you were working with in the Leverett Alliance said, great, come on up. We'll get everything set for you, which you did in a beautiful way. And one big part of getting everything set was thinking about the agenda and thinking about the sequence of stuff we were going to do and in what order and how we were going to, and you know, which would make or break make or break the exchange right there at the start. And I know you were really at the center of setting that agenda. So bring people into the process of coming up with that agenda, thinking about what we did, in what order, what methods did you bring in from your decades of peace building work around the world? How did you apply them? How did you tweak them and change them for this?
So starting with this arrival story, I kept writing to people and saying, this is a rural area. It may look something like Kentucky. There's a lot of trees and a lot of hills, and it was completely disregarded. And they were sure they were coming to a major city. And, Leverett's 1,700, 1,800 people. It's very tiny. The town hall is one little building. They arrived late at night in the pitch dark. And there we were, just a bunch of regular people, not monsters, they may have been expecting. And we were able to break the ice pretty quickly because of the similarities in our places. And I think it helped them feel comfortable. So my story with what we developed starts at the beginning. Once we had an acceptance from Ben and the Kentucky group, we had to figure out what to do. And in my work overseas, whether in Nepal with Kesab or in Bosnia with Anne or any place, I'm flying thousands and thousands of miles. I don't do short programs. You don't fly thousands of miles and do a one-day program. And so everything that I've done has been 3, 5, 7 days, sometimes 2 weeks, with the same group over and over, deepening the experience. So I understood the long form. I also, when I taught at SIT in Brattleboro, I ran a 3-week summer institute for 60 people every summer from zones of conflict around the world. And boy, did I have time to go deep in 3 weeks. It was wonderful. I would have loved 3 weeks with the Kentuckians. I would have loved 1 week. I knew I wasn't going to get it. But we settled on 3 full days, which meant that they would arrive on a Thursday night and leave on a Monday morning. So we had a frame. We had 3 full days in which to evolve. I also know that not everybody learns in the same way. Some people are very gifted verbally. Some people would rather sing or dance or take a hike or play or cook or do something else that helps them bond. So I wanted to make sure that our 3 days contained not just dialogue, which would be exhausting to do all day, but a whole host of supplementary activities that would build community. And so we had music, art, dance, drama, gorgeous potlucks from our whole community, exposure trips, outdoor hikes. It was October. They had never seen fall foliage in October before. We had every medium going in order for people to bond. The other thing I decided early and recommended to the group was that we do homestays. Why? Because what's more intimate than being in somebody's home and drinking coffee in your bathrobe with their family at their kitchen table? And actually, some of those pairs, hosts and guests, here and in Kentucky, have stayed very solid because it really matters to be in someone's home. So I did the best I could to match up what Ben told me about each person who was coming, and everybody had a homestay. And so that was basic structure. Another thing I thought about was I had 3 days. The first day, you're building the community. We're absolute strangers to each other. They're scared, we're scared. It takes time. That would be the first day. The third day, you have to say goodbye and make closure and review what you've learned, which left the second day for the intense conversations about Trump, which we had to have, and about all the auxiliary social political issues that haunt all of us. So my 3-day structure was a day of building community, building trust, explaining what dialogue is, what the guidelines are, how it works, easing people into it, developing a lot of comfort. The second day, part of the day was a public event that many of you might have attended in the Leverett Gym, where we set up 50 chairs and 300 people showed up, which was quite amazing. And the other part of that day was talking about Trump and the rest of the issues. And the third day was a little bit more of that in the morning, but then by the afternoon and evening, pulling back to reflect. How do you feel? What's happened here? What have we learned together? What do we do with what we've learned together? How does this impact us? How does this impact our communities? How does it impact our families? And how do we take it forward into the world? So that was how we put the 3-day structure together. On the very first day, I had to think about, how do you start? So we started with a go-round of introductions, and I offered some guidelines for dialogue, because safety and confidentiality are very important. And I had to sort of build this container where people would feel as safe as possible under these weird circumstances. And then I thought, I need a dialogue topic that's going to engage everybody, that everybody can participate in. And I thought, let's talk about families. We all have them. They're all complicated. They all have difficulties and great pleasures. And it'll be a nice way to start, because it's intimate, it's personal, and it's bonding. But I was a little concerned about starting out verbally. So we brought in an artist from Leverett who very beautifully set up tables with paper and pen and glue and markers and glitter and all sorts of things like kindergarten. And we all stood around, and each person had a sheet of paper and made a drawing representing their family. Family of origin, family of history, family right now, they chose. And so there we were, side by side, playing. Another way of breaking the ice and building our community. And then at the end, this artist took all of them and hung them up like squares on a quilt, which was a beautiful example of feeling bonded. Here we are together, although we're total strangers. And then we spent much of the day unpacking our family stories. And it built a tremendous amount of empathy. There was a lot of grief, a lot of tears, a lot of hugging. We were strangers, and all of this was happening on the first day. And I was glad for that. I only had 3 days, so I wanted a process that would go deep the first day. And it turned out to be memorable, and we still think about it. We didn't film any of this, by the way, because dialogue needs to be confidential, and filming was antithetical to it. We will show you a film clip. We did bring in a photographer who volunteered to work with us, a videographer, and he did 2 very short pieces that we allowed to be filmed. But this day, for example, no one's ever seen anything about it because it's too personal, and it would have sabotaged the whole business of confidentiality. So we went very deep the first day. The second day, we had some very hard conversations on political issues. We also had a square dance or contra dance Saturday night. We had a theater drama work that Ben and a theater colleague of mine did together on the first night. And we were outside when we could for breaks and walks. And we spent the whole 3 days in dialogue circles and in other activities. And that's what we did. And it's based on everything I learned in Karuna Center. So it's all fit together beautifully. And Ben also was thinking about this. His work is in cultural organizing and community organizing and storytelling. And he's also a gifted musician. And Ben, what was it like for you and for the group in terms of how they related to this and your methodology, and how did it fit for you, and what do you pull out of it?
Yeah. So I want to take a step back before talking about about their experiences there and talking about how we got there, because this is a big part of the methodology of cultural organizing. So if community organizing is about building power, right? Building power with our neighbors in order to make change. Cultural organizing is doing that work with particular attention to the ways that we make meaning together. How does a person come to be seen as a friend or an enemy? How does a tradition come to allow for the possibility of people to imagine differently? how through telling stories and singing and overall making stuff together can we open up new possibilities that aren't there when you just limit organizing to fighting a bad guy, which is too often what it is. Like organizing, I tell people, the difference between organizing and activism is the difference between the whole iceberg and the tip that's above the surface. And I focus on, there's a lot of good activists in the world. There's a lot of good campaign people in the world. My work focuses on the part of the iceberg that's beneath the surface. And where this really comes up in these kind of discussions about cross-partisan dialogue, and the question I've gotten a lot is, how did you get Trump voters to be a part of this? How did you get people on the right to be a part of this? And the answer is, we didn't start with dialogue. That in East Kentucky, we had been doing this work for a year before, primarily around co-creation, primarily around going to that community center up at the top of the mountain and saying, what are you looking to do? And them saying, we're looking to revive our square dance, and us saying, let's do that together. And it ends up being a multiple month process of figuring out all sorts of arcane micropolitics and dynamics of families, and one person yelling at another person's wife, and the whole thing. But at the end of it, this nationally renowned square dance is revived, and this community has new leadership, connected with a volunteer fire department across the county that lost its bluegrass programming when the county funding went away as money from coal severance taxes went down, and then thinking they didn't know how to gather their communities. Well, we did that, and then the volunteer fire department is run by Trump supporters with Confederate flags in the front of their trucks, and the community center that's running the square dance is run by liberals and leftists who work with the Citizen Action Organization. Suddenly they're at the same table together, not because we're here to have cross-partisan dialogue, but because if we don't support all of our community centers, they're all going to die. And it was out of that process that, of course, included dialogue, of course, included really difficult, challenging conversation, that the connections got made within Letcher County, so that when we got this communication from the people in Leverett, people who typically would not be caught dead in a dialogue space said, okay, we still are suspicious of this, but we are trusting enough of this work that we are a part of that has brought so much good to our community, to our center, to our organization, to our county, that we are going to trust each other in taking this step forward. And a big part of that is about co-creation, and a big part of that is about sharing stories in different ways. So I'll talk about one particular methodology of cultural organizing that I brought into Hands Across the Hills, which is the story circle. It comes out of civil rights organizing. It was created by the theater wing of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and developed along by that theater wing of SNCC in collaboration with Roadside Theater, where I was working at the time, and still connect with a lot. And it is a very, very intentionally structured way of sharing stories. On one hand, sharing stories is the simplest thing in the world. Everybody shares. This is very particular rules for, you start in one place, there's a prompt. You don't think about a story before you, because you're adding to the collective story with your own story and responding to what you've heard before you. And what comes out of it is coming from really personal places, a story that ends up being shared, and you find connections with each other in a deep way. So in our second time, so Kentucky came up to Leverett in October 2017. Then the Leverett people came down to East Kentucky in the spring, in April 2018. And then we went back up there in October 2019. And the conversation ended up coming back to family. And it was kind of unclear where to continue. So I said, let's do a story circle. And the prompt was actually really, because the conversation had gotten a little bit abstract. Actually, I'm sorry, it wasn't family then. It got to be family. The conversation started being about a whole bunch of different political issues, and we're trying to figure out where they all came together. And so the prompt was, tell a personal story about how you came to participate in society the way you did. That was the prompt. One person started, everybody listened, went around the circle. By the end of this circle, people in both communities were talking about these really deep stories of family-based violence that they had both gone through, irrespective of what communities they were from. And we came out of that conversation later that day. I remember somebody saying we were doing another activity. It's like, I forgot who was from Letcher County and who was from Leverett. All right, Paula, last question, last round, last question to you, which is going right off what I just said. You know, we've talked about this in the abstract. Let's take it to that personal space, as in a story circle. And let me ask you, how have you and your neighbors been impacted personally by this work that we've done together over the past 3, getting on 4 years? And how have you and your neighbors changed?
Yeah, that's the heart of it. The heart of it is about transformation, and that's why I like a long form. That's why I loved having our 3-day weekends, because I'm wanting to get to the heart in people and to the deepest place we can go, and that's how transformation happens. And I'm interested in people's personal transformation in terms of shifting attitudes and behaviors, including my own. I'm also interested in how we take this into social transformation, so that we take the sensitivity we've learned and bring it into our institutions and our organizations. For me, this has been profound. None of us are free from stereotypes. None of us are free from generalizations, from judgments, from making up stories about Trump voters, Hillary voters, Southerners, Northerners, whatever the divisions are, we have stories about them. And so certainly I, like everybody else, had stories about Kentucky that existed from here to here that were not necessarily real. And the profoundness of our exchanges and the depth of the people and the resilience around struggles that would have just drowned an ordinary person, remarkable. And I found my heart opening. And I and everybody else by the end of the 3 days said, wow, we're friends. Look what we have in common. One woman kept saying over and over again, we all want the same thing. We want healthcare, we want education for our children, we want security for our old age. We want a peaceful environment, we want cleanly environments. We have different ideas of how to get there, but we all want the same thing. And I felt that myself. I felt that there were so many ways in which we could bond and forget about who voted for who. And one of the things that I say in all the talks that I give is, I've learned that a person is larger than their vote. We are not just who we vote for. And who we vote for is so complicated. It comes out of so many family, historical, geographic, political, media-oriented impacts in our lives. And we don't come to that decision easily. So I have been very understanding. My understanding is much deeper than I ever thought it would be. My compassion, my care. And here's the important thing for me. It's not just that I've changed. It's what I do with how I've changed. Because otherwise we're just impacting 30 people, and that's a lot of work for 30 people. But I want society to change. So what's happened for me, what's happened for me is making sure that in my conversations now, when I hear people making generalizations about Trump voters, I interrupt them and say, there's a story there. There's a human being You don't know and I don't know, but it's about something. It's never about nothing. And how do I help you realize that there's a deep story? How do I help myself realize that? That in every one of these generalizations and stereotypes, there's so much more than meets the eye. So I find myself in all the conversations about divides in this country, which are endless in our community, I find myself saying, we can't dismiss anybody. We may not agree with the behavior, certainly with the extremist behavior. None of us would condone any of that. It's not about condoning. It's about knowing it's about something. Behavior never arises in a vacuum. I'm a psychologist. I understand that. I used to be a therapist in an earlier chapter of my life. I know what this is about. And it's there in all of us. And having the empathy and the compassion for others is the way that we take all that we've learned in this dialogue, all the personal transformation, and use it for social transformation and political transformation. So it's becoming an upstander. It's standing up for other people who are also being swept away in great stereotypes and generalizations, and reminding us that their story has created who they are. And we need to know that story to understand them and to care deeply about them. So I have found this profoundly transformational and profoundly important. And in the past 3 years since we've started, I've become kind of a public educator trying to advocate for people to take this work on, to build across these impossible polarizations that are crippling our country, because we need each other and we can find each other. So that's my story. And Ben, you've also had a transformational story. You didn't have to get to know New Englanders because you are one, but a lot of things happened for you as well here. And I'd love to hear your 5 minutes of this.
Sure. The first thing that struck me, I think it was like the second morning that we were in Leverett back in 2017, was the Kentuckians had all memorized all the names of everybody in Leverett. There were a lot of them. There were maybe 17 or so. And I consider myself, I'm a teacher, I'm an organizer, I'm pretty good at, knowing who people are. They had me beat. And that has continued. And what I mean by that is I was not prepared for the level of investment that people in East Kentucky would have in their relationships with people in Leverett. And that was me underestimating them, honestly. And that similar to what Paula said about being an advocate, it's like when people in East Kentucky now see something on the news about something going on up in the Northeast, they will call people in Leverett. There are all sorts of, there are so many of these ongoing informal conversations and informal relationships that continue to happen, and conversations that, Paula and I didn't choreograph when an agroforestry specialist in Leverett in Massachusetts starts building a relationship with the former director of the farmers market in Letcher County, who was on the trip and still is involved. And suddenly growers in Letcher County are growing raw materials for Lush Cosmetics, right? There's a bakery in East Kentucky started by another participant in Hands Across the Hills that's named for a bakery in Amherst, the Black Sheep Bakery and Catering Company. Highly recommended if you're ever down there. It's real good. That's, I think, the thing that really just struck me, that just the open hearts of people that are everywhere. And at the same time, and I'm looking at one person in particular who's on this call, when we get, we can get kind of mushy about, it's all the, we're the same, we're so connections. There's one person in Leverett who in particular, it's like, yeah, but Trump's also doing a lot of really bad stuff. It's like, yes, and to hold that, I don't think I fully understood the meaning of, the Southern Christian saying to hate the sin and love the sinner, because it can come off as kind of harsh, but I realize it's a form of nonviolence. It's the same as what we mean when we talk about nonviolence in more liberal and secular spaces, which I can absolutely despise the fact that you voted for a man who reminds me of the people who killed my great-grandparents in Germany. And I can still love you with all of my being, and embrace you and let you into my home and fully understand you as much a neighbor and an ally and a member of my people as anybody else. And I think for me personally, being a Northeasterner that then lived in Letcher County, I'm sort of on the search for sort of where home is for me. But I think sort of what I got from this was a real expanded sense of where my home is and could be in both places, and learning a lot, in fact, about New Englanders, because my family are New Yorkers, and so I had a lot to learn too.
Great.
So much more we can say. Paula, you're gonna say something? I was going to segue into a clip.
What I want to say is we're going to give you a 10-minute video clip next, which was filmed at the time we went to Kentucky. We would have been back in Kentucky this year, but COVID stopped us, so it'll happen in the future. But we've been there just once. They've been to us twice, so it's our turn. And after the 10 minutes, we will have a half an hour for Q&A. So please, you can put your questions in now and we'll be monitoring them. And we'll start to do the Q&A right after the video. And this is a segment of a larger video, but it's pretty powerful.
We'll put the whole thing in the chat. This is an excerpt from our second weekend together. So April 2018 in Letcher County, Kentucky.
And if you haven't been to our website, it's loaded with information, including this.
We're experts on Appalachia.
I don't know how many people are in here voted for Trump, but I know I'm for him all the way.
And that's what I want to hear, I want to hear why. What am I missing?
Because I think he's for the better good of the country.
Well, first of all, where I live in the Upper Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, we often refer to it as a bubble. It's protected. There's this invisible bubble that protects us from the outside world. And living in that bubble, I think, also makes us, feel superior to others. Why are these people so marginalized? Why are they in such desperate straits? What's happened to them?
Talk about tears. I could cry a river over how hard that we have struggled. And it's not just me. It's been Neil. It's been Letha. It's been all of us. How hard. Velda, for instance. I know how hard Velda lived. We did those kind of things. And I could cry a river over my hardships, but I'm above it. I'm above it. And what I'm afraid of is that I'm 76 years old and I'm not going to see the progress that you folks have seen from Levitt. I'm going to miss that as a human being because I was born in a place that is deprived and oppressed.
It's a very good place to take a moment, just take a moment and let's just let that sink. Let this just take a moment. We need a moment. Just slow down a minute. Hands popping up fast. Thank you for that, Kendall. And Susan and everybody else.
I didn't come here to study you, and I don't think any of us did. We came here to experience Appalachia, and we are all richer for this experience that we've had.
Just being with you, just sitting in your presence, watching you be with each other, how you are with me, I feel I know you, and I don't feel that I need to have questions about your opinions answered. I just am getting to know you more and more deeply. And I have not wanted to ask Velda anything. I'm getting to know, she has opened her house to me. She feeds me in the morning. We drive around. I see her relating as she sees people she knows in the community. I feel I know her.
You know, I'm really happy to know all you all, and I'm really thankful for the conversation that Kip and I had. And it was a knockdown drag out, and I got pretty heated. I didn't pull a gun on him, but I did want to hit him. Just kidding, Kip. But maybe I'm just kidding. But I was glad for that conversation, because I think these conversations about class and about gun control and about all these controversial things are so valuable for us to have, and to hear the other side of the argument.
Having hard conversations in a civil manner is a success in this country, and the more we can evangelize, if you will, the basic civil discourse, irrespective of policy outcomes or preferences, that when we can sit down and have a conversation civilly, that's huge. And when we can do it and get this close together emotionally, that's just icing on the cake to me.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. It's beautiful.
There's so much work, political work, that is not, I will call it political work, that is not activism, that is not partisanship, that is not pro or anti, but is no less pointed and potentially powerful because of it.
We all need belonging, and we all need self-development. And sometimes they don't work in the same place at the same time. And so I learned a lot about that listening to you, because in that way your lives are quite different from the lives of many of us in this circle, in terms of where our parents are, where our children are, what we expect from our family, and what we expect from our friendship network, which is a different kind of a family, and building on that. And those were really important for me. It's this human heart that connects us, and connects our longing, and connects our sense of care for each other everywhere. So I relearned that with this group.
I've met you people, and I'm beginning to respect you and care for you, each one of you. And I don't believe that if something happened to me in your presence, a bad thing or something, that you wouldn't try to help. And that's what we're about. We try to help each other. That's what Americans do. We pull together. We might pull apart for a while, but when something really comes down to threaten us in a way that, individually we can't do anything about it, we will pull together.
It is worth it, and we have built this.
So there's our little model dialogue. And we're open to questions, but also feelings. You can be speaking from here, you can be speaking from here about what you feel as you listen to this, as you listen to the whole evening and watch the video. And what comes up for you by way of both feelings and questions.
So people should feel free to unmute themselves and respond. I mean, I thank you for typing. We've got some questions, but per Paula's request for how you're feeling, just unmute yourselves.
I just wish more people could see it. It was a beautiful, you captured something so special from that group, and you could see people's feelings were really opening, and it was really great to see.
Thanks, Jamil. Libby, you had a hand up.
this is so moving to me, and what it helps me remind myself is that I grew up in Indiana, and I grew up in a very prejudiced family. And so there's so much to unlearn about what we're taught. And there's no better way to do it than to meet with the people from whom we feel distanced, and hear their story, learn about their life. I mean, this was very touching and moving to me. I really appreciate the power of that, making that human connection and crossing the divide, crossing lines, or crossing the hills. It was beautiful, and I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
And you've been doing it your whole life also, Libby, running these wonderful conversations and dialogues with Israelis and Palestinians and people in this country, and you're doing the same work.
All right, Paula, you want to field some questions, or should
Sure.
we look in the chat and
No,
yeah, go for it.
let me just, there are a number of great questions. So Ben, here's one, and I wondered about it too. Somebody's asked, how did you learn about cultural organizing? I mean, that was not a term that I was familiar with either, so I was really interested in what you said. So I'm just wondering about that and how you got to that.
Yeah, like most other good things in my life, ass backwards. So I was a theater maker who cared about politics. My dad was a journalist for most of my childhood, and I got involved in various kinds of political theater as a young person. And I found that, frankly, most people involved in political theater kind of more interested in making big statements than making a lot of change. And a lot of egotism, a lot of what I would call sadomasochism, which is, I think, when people say, call out culture, cancel culture, identity politics, like all those things have good and bad, right? Good to be able to recognize when there is bad and to have pride in who you are. But the bad parts of what we call out culture, cancel culture, identity politics, I call egotism and sadomasochism, which is you're making it more about yourself and propping yourself up than doing the work. And the people that weren't like that in the world of political theater that I knew had backgrounds in organizing. And so I got involved in the cultural work first and the community organizing second. And then when I met, it was through meeting a couple of elders and mentors coming out of civil rights that taught this tradition of bringing those, doing both of those two things seriously, taking culture seriously and taking power seriously. So cultural organizing is a term that I think Roadside was one of the first to use, along with the term community cultural development. And what it means is, again, organizing based on making stuff together and taking seriously the way we make meaning together, and recognizing that, a meeting and an accountability session and a protest and all of the other kind of tropes of traditional organizing, it's one way of making meaning together, one way of many. And that when you start working together based on what you want to build together, which is what we did both locally in the Letcher County Culture Hub and then in Hands Across the Hills, as opposed to what's the deficit that you want to fix, right? So starting with the hills as opposed to the divides, right? We're going to get to the divides. Got to talk about the divides. Can't pretend they're not there. But just like in the question about capitalism and deep structures, the short answer to that is yes, we absolutely talk about those things, and we can talk about that more. But when you start with the deficits, when you start with what you don't have, then you're not starting with very much. And a thing that I like to say is no two human beings on God's green earth have ever built a relationship based on what they don't have. You always start with what you do have, even if all you have is curiosity, right? That's what we shared. We're from rural places. We're from hill country. We're kind of pissed off about the way things are going in the country, and we're curious enough to ask of each other. And so that's how I came into cultural organizing. I also feel the need to give a shout out to my colleague Denise Griffin Johnson in West Baltimore at the Arts Social Community Network. In a second, I'll put a link to a chat, an article in the chat that Denise and I wrote together, kind of defining cultural organizing and making sense of it. So
that's great. Great. super interesting. And it was, I mean, just from the get-go of the choice of the name, you know, that you guys, it wasn't, you know, anything about divides, you know, what do you have in common? Hills. I mean, it's quite sort of, you know,
It
illustrative.
was actually a woman from Massachusetts who's been living in
I
Letcher
also
County
named
for a long
Karuna
time.
Center, and Karuna means compassion. So again, it was named for something positive, not
Right.
something negative.
The divides. Yeah.
Well, I want to respond to a question that I see on the chat that's come up in several different ways, which is this all emotional? Are you avoiding the issues? No. We talk about Trump. We talk about all the hard issues. On the first weekend, as I said, we had a theater. So theater games is a way of getting into our issues. And it was, again, it was the very first weekend. It was the first night. It was Friday night. And Ben and a theater colleague organized some theater experiences. And one of the things that we wanted to talk about was guns, which is a big divide and a big difference in how we approach that. And the question that I developed, I want you to listen to carefully, because the question that I developed was, what makes you feel safe? So it wasn't a question that was for either side or attacking either side or blaming or judging. It was a deeper question. And most people in Leverett talked about nobody having guns makes us feel safe. And many people in Kentucky talked about everybody having guns makes us feel safe. And then they talked about the opioid crisis and the fact that people are robbing the grandmother's televisions to sell for money for opioids. And if they don't have a gun, they can't protect the grandmother. So we were at this very hard issue, but in a way that we could hear each other. We don't like to do this because no one's listening when you're banging against each other. We want to go underneath and get to, how come you feel this way? What's your life experience that leads you to vote for Trump, that leads you to want guns, that leads you about immigration? Immigration is another issue. Very important story I want to tell. Again, on the first day of the first visit, when the Kentuckians were in Leverett and we were doing family stories, it was explained that many of the people, several of the people in our group, are first generation Americans, and many were second generation Americans. And for the Kentuckians, this was unusual because they're people of a place. They came from the Scots-Irish area long time ago. And there's not a lot of traffic in and out of that area. It's not a place where refugees and immigrants tend to go. It doesn't have a lot of work or a lot of opportunity for them. And so they don't know immigrants and refugees in the same way that we do, because of our own backgrounds and because of the kind of community that we live in. And we're East Coasters and refugees come in through the coasts often. So one of the women from Kentucky after the first day said, I was taught to hate immigrants and refugees, but I never knew any. And now I know you. And now I can transfer that knowledge of you to other immigrants and refugees and not hate them either. So that's also getting at a very difficult hot button issue, but in a way that goes through the heart rather than through an argument. So we talked about Trump directly. We talked about a lot about how we feel, about how people voted. But we tried not to do it from a place of destroying each other, because that shuts down conversation. I hope that answers that question, because that's one that I get all the time in these groups. What are we really doing? We're really talking about the hard issues in a way that I call good communication.
It's about the how, not the what.
Right.
We can talk about anything, and we do talk about, in fact, just in the past months, doing dialogues over Zoom, because that's what we've had to do during COVID, and we finally got at what I think was the hardest question and was unspoken between us for a long time, which is class, which is the fact that people in Letcher County came up and they were, living in, often staying in really nice places in Leverett. And of course, it's an overstatement to say everybody in Leverett's got a lot of money and everybody in Letcher County doesn't. That's not true. And that's not true among the people participating in Hands Across the Hills either. But the shame that, like, there were people, and they said this in the dialogue, when the people in Leverett came down to East Kentucky, they didn't want to host them in their houses because they were ashamed. And they gave other reasons at the time. And then, 2 years later, having built that trust, they were ready to say it. And so anyway, I think, we can talk about any issue, but the question is how do we talk about it? And do we start from a story? Do we start where people are? To the question in the chat about people voting to make their lives worse, the question is, well, according to whom? And you ask people that and they'll tell you all sorts of things. And I'm happy to get into the substantive part of it, but the important thing from a method perspective is we can't decide what makes someone else's life better or worse. Right. We can't presume that, and we can't presume that we are rational and other people are not. I'll tell you one other story, and I know we got a lot of other questions. Toward the end of the visit in Kentucky, we had people put questions up on the wall. What lingering questions do you still have? And one of the questions from someone in Leverett was, what would it take for you people in Kentucky to let go of coal? And I thought it was an interesting question. I was, thought it was good and thought-provoking. I did not realize that to a lot of the people in Kentucky, it would have been offensive. Not everyone, but I remember at least one person sort of told me afterwards, kind of confided in me that, like, who says we want to let go of coal? What would it take for people in Massachusetts to let go of something that they care about, that they've made their livelihoods on for decades? And this is someone who lost her husband in a mining accident. So this is someone who is in no way ignorant to the danger and harm that the coal mining economy has done to East Kentucky. But the point is, what she was responding to, which I think is really valid, is we need to be able to say what's important in our lives and what we care about enough to vote for and to act on, and what we're willing to sacrifice for that. And we can have a discussion about it and we can criticize each other for it. But if we come in assuming that we know somebody else's life, somebody else's world, somebody else's community better than they do, then there's no opportunity for dialogue. And that's the problem with the what's the matter with Kansas stuff and the why are you voting against your interests and all of that, because it assumes that I know what your interests are better than you do. And people resent that. I resent that. I think everyone resents that.
Thank you. So I got a few more questions that I want to respond to. First, I want to say about talking about class. Nobody wants to talk about class. We'll talk about race, religion, and all sorts of other things before we'll talk about class. It's really a hidden issue in the country. And we've been doing it in Leverett also just with ourselves, because every town has class differences. Every group has class differences, and it's hard. Also, I wanted to let you know that I always teach people how to ask questions when I run dialogues, because we're not very good at question asking. And many of our questions are negative, and there's sort of a comment with a question mark at the end. I remember when Ann and I worked in Bosnia, the major question was, why did you start the war? I mean, you can't get a more blamey question than that, can you? Or why did you vote for Trump? Or why do you want to hang on to coal? These are questions with blame in them. And we teach people to ask questions that begin with how or what, because the answer to why is a long, long, long story. But ask people how. How does this impact you? What are you seeing in this? What are your major concerns about this? And learning to ask questions helps people participate more in the group. because they feel comfortable asking something and they know they're asking something that's going to resonate with the people they're asking it to. So that's always a big part of our dialogue. There were two more questions I saw in the chat. Penfield asked a question and Alan asked a question I want to answer. Penfield asked about how do you get people to talk about in your town, in a small town, how do you bring people together? And Penfield wondered if storytelling was useful. And I said, storytelling is wonderful. And she suggested, should we talk about our families of origin and our ancestry and how we got to this country and how we got to this town? Absolutely. Because what you want to do in the beginning with a new group is build common ground. And one common ground is you all got to Amherst, or you all got to Northampton, or you all got to Letcher County. How did that happen in your family? So this is very useful. Alan asked about race. Unfortunately, Leverett is a pretty white town, way whiter than we wish it was, and no people of color signed up for our group. And Letcher County is pretty white also.
Over 98%.
And no people of color signed up for their group.
We just got our first, actually.
We just got one.
We've had more involved locally, but just one person out that yes, I want to do.
So yes, we talked about race, but we couldn't talk about it in the same way that we talked about religious differences that exist in the group or class differences that exist in the group, which was a loss for all of us. But we certainly talked about it because it's one of the key issues. When the Black Lives Matter thing happened, it was a big issue between us. How did we experience that in Leverett? And of course, it wasn't uniform in Leverett or Letcher County either, but more or less, how were people in our region experiencing BLM and how are we responding? And how was that going down in Kentucky and what were they seeing? So yes, we talk about as many of the very, very difficult issues as we possibly can, because that's what makes this a good dialogue. And we don't want to shy away from any of the issues. We talked last time we met on Zoom about the Capitol riots and the Biden election. We talked about all these things. We have another Zoom coming up this Saturday. We'll be talking again about the question for Saturday is, what's the state of the country now and how does that impact you? How does that trickle down to your community and your family? And what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? So it's very political, but it's coming at it from a personal experience instead of from an analytical experience. So those are some more questions I wanted to answer. And Polly, you might have time for a little more.
Yeah, just a little more. And I think Ben's point out that someone's had her hand up for a while. Then I do have two that I want to glomp together to ask you. But do you have a question?
So you touched on this a little bit in answering the last question, but I was really wondering, like, how you think the group and the dynamic of the group may have been different, like if there were people of color or like people who are openly LGBT.
Oh, we had those.
Or like other identities that are, more intrinsic than like a matter of, what your opinion is on gun control, etc. Because a lot of people on the right, do really have prejudices that are about intrinsic things about people that they can't change, right?
Can you go ahead, please? I want to question your premise a little bit because we actually did have, we had several LGBT people involved. And they're all differences. I'm sorry?
Big religious differences.
And big religious differences. And I also want to say, in my experience, and we've done this work in other contexts across race, across rural and urban, we have had people in East Kentucky who are staunch Trump supporters working in the middle of West Baltimore at an African American social club. So we absolutely have experience doing this work across racial lines, across ethnic lines, and it works the same. That in my experience, the people's political differences are no less intrinsic than people's racial or ethnic or gender or sexual orientation differences. What it is in all cases is, and thank you, Alan, for bringing 1619 into it, because you're absolutely right. What it is in all cases is, I have been convinced that you over there are a threat to what I hold most dear. And you have maybe been convinced that I am a threat to what you hold most dear. And that is the thing that we are working against. We are taught to work against each other, as opposed to working against the lie that we have both been told. And that is true. And in terms of race, it was invented very specifically to keep us from organizing together. And it was created by the people that wanted to exploit us both. And we can go down the line with every kind of imposed divide of every kind. Does not mean that there are not inequalities of our experience, of our access to resources, of the way we're treated by law enforcement, by different administrative systems. Privilege is real, and privilege is also imposed by those that wish to keep us divided. And so this particular project is a project, has been a project of white people. Again, that is starting to change, but we have done, all of us, and I know I'm speaking of the work that I've done. I know Paula has done extensive multiracial and multi-ethnic dialogue and exchange projects as well. Obviously, the dynamics of every group is different, but really the basics of what we've been talking about are a constant.
I would agree with that. And the religious differences came up very sharply in our group from the first day on. Our group had Christians and Jews right across the spectrum. We had people who were evangelical and people who belonged to the UCC or some other progressive Christian group. We had Jews with various kinds of orientations and backgrounds. And that was new for a lot of people. And we talked about it a lot. And as Ben said, we dealt with LGBT people. Not everybody was the same sexual preference in the group. And so we had a lot of things to talk about. Those were all hot button issues. We didn't have any Muslims, but we talked about Islam. We talked about the difficulty of being Islamic in America now. It came up around refugees again. So we pretty much dealt with the issues that needed to be talked about. And we try not to hide anything from each other. We try to get them out and talk about them. And I think the longer we go, the deeper we get, the more trust we build. And so far, this shows no sign of ending. We're eager to go back to Kentucky whenever we really feel safe again, whenever that might be, we will do it. And in the meantime, we're committed to Zoom. And the Leverett people are also committed to working with each other on various things. And because we've had so much publicity, we're having a chance to try to teach. Because one of the last questions was, well, how can you all help expand this work? Which is, try it out, set up a little dialogue group. Try to find some people who have some differences from you. Doesn't really matter what they're on, and experiment. And there's lots and lots of material, including lots of how-to material about dialogues on the Hands Across the Hills website. It's very extensive, and you'll find lots of resources there to help you. So Polly, I guess we're almost out of time.
Yeah, no, that's great. Actually, that was exactly was going to be my last, because that was my first question for you. It's kind of piggybacking on Penfield's a bit, but so what, where do you see opportunities? Because I think everybody, you can't help but be pretty impressed and inspired by this work. And I think, it's part of the objective of this series is just to give ideas to people of how they can engage. So I guess that was your answer to that question, is just form a group. I mean, it may not be Kentucky to Massachusetts. It may be, Ben, as you articulated so well, you started with your work, really started with all the divisions within the area and the county you were working with, and sort of start where you are. I guess was pretty much what you would advise, I guess, people in terms of how to engage. Okay. All right. Well, I think we should there are more questions, but okay, I'll just, Christina has just asked a good one about the risks. I mean, there was a question about trauma and about how, challenges of people who are dealing with trauma, and, are there risks of, if you mess it up, of deepening divides if this is not done well? I mean, obviously this is an example of really skilled facilitation of this process. And maybe briefly about that, about anything about
I'll be happy
risks.
to answer that. The job of a facilitator is this: it's to build and hold a container to hold the group, and that means encouraging the group to do the best work they can, the deepest work they can, but also protecting people from themselves or from others if that becomes necessary. And I've always been glad that I was a therapist first before I got into this work, because I'm not afraid of emotions, because that's what therapy is all about. And I know how to hold people through emotional difficulties. And a group is just an assembly of individuals, all of whom need encouragement to open up more, but also protection if they're getting caught up in something they shouldn't be caught up in. And you saw that in the video after Kendall did this enormous self-disclosure. I said, let's just be silent for a moment. Let's just take in what we've just heard, because it was so painful. And his heart was hanging out in that moment. And the only thing I could think of for right away was, take a deep breath, sit with it. Don't answer it right away, because you'll dilute it. Just let it be there. So that's the job of a facilitator. And the more you do this, the better you get at it. It's a skill, but it's a developable skill that you can learn. And it will hold, if you can hold the group, that's really your task. And people do not generally get traumatized in these groups because it's not therapy. It's therapeutic and it's not therapy. It's different. And you will understand the difference, because most of you have had enough therapy experience to understand what therapy is. And this is a therapeutic in the sense of it's healing and it's changing, but it is not psychotherapy. And facilitators don't want to go there, because that's not our role. I think that answers it, Polly.
I think that answers it. So I think, unless Ben, if you have any last words.
Very quickly, yeah, which is to say, it's a choice, right? It is a choice to participate in this kind of work. And in my opinion, no one should ever be forced to do it, because it is really challenging. And it's really, and there are risks to opening yourself like that. And in Kentucky, when we were talking about the people who, inviting people in, we said we want people that are ready to listen to where other people are coming from, and also to really stand fast in where you're coming from. And not everybody is ready to do that, and that's okay. And some people, and they may come to it later. I mean, the reason to the question about don't start with dialogue, it depends on the community. Some people are ready to go. They want a dialogue. They're ready to do it. I was responding specifically to the question about conservatives, and people that generally that don't do dialogue as much of their practice. Starting in different forms of co-creation often help bring in. But yeah, there's, it's citizens. It is human beings, citizens, neighbors, whatever language you want to use, coming together and making something together and learning to understand each other better. And there is always a risk to that. There's a risk to democracy. There's a risk to community. There's a risk to any form of co-creation. If you don't want to take that risk, nobody's going to force you. But a lot of people do. And a lot of people do who we wouldn't assume do. There were people in Kentucky who I almost didn't ask to join because I just assumed they wouldn't want to do it. And some of them have become the most avid participants.
That is great. So I think we will wrap it up. I am just sort of echoing all the little notes in the chat of thanking you both for really inspiring. I mean, really inspiring, including our friend from Nepal who's just, commented. So I can't thank you enough for your work on this project. And it's great to know that it's still going via Zoom. And I think, can speak for all of us that you've given us a lot a lot to think about. So I really cannot thank you both for your time and for your work on this. And with that, I'm just going to say that I hope that some of you will be able to join us for the rest of the series, including, which is going to focus some on work overseas, Nigeria, Bosnia, Rwanda, and other work here in the US. And finally, as you may have noticed in our last announcement, there is an amazing talk by an amazing guy, Joseph Sebaranzi, Rwandan, who is going to be talking at 7 o'clock. It just so happens that it's following right after this. And we sent a link to that for anybody who was able to do that. But thank you again, all of you, for showing up, and really to Ben and Paula for the work and sharing it with us. It was really fabulous and deeply appreciated.
And wonderful to see so many of you. Thank you for being here.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much
all.
for taking your time.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.